This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video we're going to continue our study of the SAT test and how to prepare for that test. In our first video, we did something of a general introduction. We talked about what the SAT is. We talked about who makes the SAT. I talked a little bit about why the SAT is important and why it needs to be prepared for. I also said that my intention in these videos is to help Catholic students, in particular, to prepare well for the SAT. In this second video, we're going to start to get into the test itself. We're going to talk about what's on the SAT. And like I said, as we go through this course, I'm going to go through every detail of the SAT, all of the different question types, strategies, tricks, how scoring works, how to prepare, practice tests, how to register for the SAT. We'll go through everything. So just go along with me, one lesson at a time, and we'll cover everything. In this video, I'd like to get into what's actually on the SAT, and this is a little bit confusing because it's changed a few times through the years. The SAT, when I took it as a high school junior and senior, it was pretty simple. There were two main parts of the SAT. Each was scored out of a total of 800 points, and so you could get 800 points on the verbal SAT section, as we referred to it, and you could get 800 points on the math section. It was just verbal and math, and that's how we talked about it. Everyone who went around talked about their SAT score as a total out of 1,600. 1,600 being the highest, and you could easily see where someone was based on their SAT score because we all knew it was out of 1,600. Then the test changed and they added an essay section, an essay to the SAT, and that made the total out of a 2,100 score. And so now it was sort of confusing because the scores didn't mean the same thing anymore, and it sounded like people had good scores, but when you considered it was out of a total of a higher number, it actually wasn't as good a score. And so it got messy, and then more recently they've done away with that and gone back to the 1,600 point scale, which I think is helpful and I'm happy about. So some confusion about what's actually on the SAT because it's changed a couple of times through the years. And I'd like to talk about that and then get into the different parts of the test. So let's just go through that. Most importantly, in 2021, which is this past summer, actually, I'm making this in December 2021. In July 2021, the essay is no longer included in the SAT. There's no more essay on the SAT. So now we're just back to that original verbal and math score, total out of 1,600 points, which is good. It's simpler and just back to the basics, which the SAT should be. What's really funny is that in 2020 and 2021, even though I've spent most of my professional career teaching SAT prep as a high school teacher, my 3 adult children have all been admitted to college, and not one of them has had to take the SAT test because of COVID. So even though they had the advantage growing up of a dad who taught SAT prep, my 3 eldest children, when the time came, didn't even have to take the SAT because COVID made the testing sessions all cancel, and the colleges admitted students without SAT scores. So it's just kind of funny. When I was a kid, the SAT was just solid as a rock. Everybody had to take the SAT. Everyone knew the SAT was coming. Everyone prepared for the SAT. But over the years, it's gotten confusing. There are political movements that protest the SAT. It's been kind of messy, but I think it's finally starting to get simple again. And like I said, in 2021, the essay section is gone. The essay idea was a mess. I was actually an SAT essay grader, so I got to see firsthand how they tried to prepare teachers to score SAT essays, and just what a mess it all was. And thankfully that's all gone, and we're just back to the 2 basic sections of a verbal SAT test and a math SAT test with a total score of 1600. So a number of changes through the years, but fortunately for you, you're going to be taking an SAT that's much better, much simpler than it has been over the past 10 or so years. So that's good news for you. As for the parts of the SAT, there are 4 basic parts of the SAT, even though they can be grouped into 3 parts. We have, we have 2 verbal sections and we have 2 math sections. So 2 verbal sections, 2 math sections. As I said, this is a total of 800 points. Math, a total of 800 points. A total possible of 1600 points on the SAT. Very simple again. 4 sections, 2 verbal, 2 math. The first section is reading comprehension. You're going to be given passages to read. They're going to be extremely boring, difficult passages that the SAT test makers know you will know nothing about and have nothing to do with any of your high school studies. It'll be testing your ability to read something unfamiliar and comprehend what an author writes when you don't know the author, you don't know the topic, you don't know the subject, and so on. That's one of these college success skills, whether you're able to read something new and challenging and comprehend it. It's an important skill. The reading section will consist of around 50 questions. I think the number is actually 52 questions, and you'll have 65 minutes to complete those 50 questions. Now, when you think about reading comprehension, 50 questions in 65 minutes, that's not a lot of time. And so one of the things that I want you to see right off the bat here as we get started is that the pressure created on the test taker by the time limit is one of the important parts of the SAT. And strategy for how to take the SAT largely has to do with learning how to make the most of the time that you have, because it's intentionally high pressure because of the time limit. 52 questions on reading comprehension with only 65 minutes to read and answer questions about the reading. And like I said, the answer choices are going to be intended to trap common students. It's very difficult, and you're going to have to know how to make the most out of your time. 52 questions, just 65 minutes. That's a tight limit for reading comprehension. That's the first part. The second part, I wrote language here. We might call it writing and language. It really is a test of grammar and sentence syntax and construction. So language, you have 44 questions. Look at the time again, only 35 minutes. All right, so time pressure on these tests, 52 questions for reading, 44 questions for writing and language, total of 94 questions in 110 minutes. That's a tight time limit. And as I said, total of 800 points on those 2 verbal sections together. That's the first part. The second part is mathematics. The first part of the math test, you have questions in mathematics that you are not allowed to use a calculator for. No calculator. You have 20 questions and 25 minutes to answer those questions. Again, time crunch with a high pressure from the time limit. The second math section, you are allowed to use a calculator. You have 38 questions and 55 minutes for those 38 questions. That gives you a total, if you add up the time, a test total of 3 hours. So the SAT is a 3-hour test that you take in one sitting. So it's an exhausting experience. You're going to start probably 9 o'clock in the morning or so and get done at noon. A 3-hour test that you really have to know how to prepare for and how to strategically go about this test so that you can make the most of those 3 hours and get the highest possible score. So those are the parts of the SAT. Now, let me just say a few things generally about these. And again, we're going to go into all of the details of these tests, all the different question types, strategies, practice questions and tests, and so on. But just generally speaking, like I said, reading comprehension, let's go back to thinking about the college success skills. When you go to college, you have to take lots of different courses. You get to choose a major. You get to choose an area of study that you like and are interested in, you want to work in, you want to focus on. But you also have to take courses outside of that major that you're interested in. You have to take general education courses. You have to study all kinds of different subjects: psychology, sociology, natural sciences, arts, and so on. One of the challenges of college studies is you have to do a lot of reading and study in subjects that you are not interested in or familiar with, and that reading is difficult. You also have to do a lot of writing and reports. And in those reports, you need to consult academic writings by researchers and scientists, and it's very boring, very dry reading. And you have to show that you're able to get into something that's written, you're able to read it, understand the author's point, understand the vocabulary that the author uses based on what you read, not on prior knowledge. That's a different skill. Your ability to read and comprehend something that you're not familiar with. That's the purpose of the reading section on the SAT. So it's not going to be a reading about something you've studied in high school. It's going to be a reading about some topic that you have nothing to do with. It could be as boring as can be, but that's the point. It's going to test your ability to read something unfamiliar, maybe something that's not interesting, understand the writer's message, understand the writer's language, and answer questions about that reading. Okay, so that's the purpose of the reading comprehension section. And then for the language section, it's about grammar. And this is why I always say modern students in modern schools, they're often avoiding classical Christian studies because they think, I want to go to college, I want to do well on standardized tests. The problem is that when you get to the standardized tests, it's looking for the classical liberal arts. And so if you would just focus on classical studies, focus on grammar studies, focus on reasoning and rhetoric, focus on those traditional Christian studies, you would actually be better prepared for the SAT than modern students are prepared. So your knowledge of grammar and sentence construction will really help you on the language section. So in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, if you're studying and you study elementary grammar, classical grammar, Latin and Greek grammar, reasoning and rhetoric, you'll be very well prepared for the language section on the SAT. But of course, we'll look at these test questions and see exactly what kind of information they're going to test you on and how you can successfully answer those questions. Because a lot of this is strategy. A lot of this is strategy and tricks. As weird as that may sound, when you learn how this test works and how to answer the questions, you'll find that there are a lot of tricks to help you get the highest possible score. But being able to read and understand unfamiliar writings and understanding grammar and sentence construction is what's tested on the verbal sections of the SAT. As for math, you may hear students in high school talking about trigonometry and calculus and these higher maths. None of that is on the SAT. None of that is on the SAT. Studying trigonometry and calculus will not help you one bit on the SAT. It has nothing to do with those math courses. The only thing that's tested on the SAT, arithmetic modern high school geometry, and algebra. That's it. That's all that's on the SAT. Anything pursued above that in school has nothing to do with the SAT test. And in fact, students who rush into those higher maths to try to make their transcript look better often don't spend enough time on algebra and geometry and cause themselves to earn a lower score on the SAT. So trying to show off and rush into higher high school math courses may backfire if it causes you to get a lower score on the SAT. The only thing the SAT tests is arithmetic, geometry, and algebra. And so the more time you focus on those subjects, the better you'll be helped in your SAT test on the math section. Now, what these math sections test, you might think, well, students in different schools using different textbooks learn all different methods. They learn all different ways to solve problems. They study all different topics. How can there be a standardized test on mathematics? And the answer is that the SAT doesn't care how anyone learns to solve math problems in high school math courses. That's not what the SAT tests. What the SAT is going to test is your ability to solve problems. It's going to give you problems that you've never seen before. These problems are not going to come from high school math textbooks. They're going to be complicated problems that are going to test your knowledge of the principles of arithmetic, geometry, and algebra. It's going to test your knowledge of the principles and whether or not, when you're presented with a problem that you've never seen before, you can figure out how to use those principles of arithmetic, geometry, and algebra to solve new and unfamiliar problems. Because in real life, that's what problems are. When you're in high school math, the teacher will say, okay, this is how you solve this problem. Step 1, step 2, step 3. And then when you are given a homework assignment, the teacher will check to see that you did step 1, step 2, step 3. On the test, you'll be tested to see if you followed step 1, step 2, step 3. That's not real life. In real life, you don't need to follow step 1, step 2, step 3. On the SAT, these problems don't care about step 1, step 2, step 3. They don't care what any teacher required students to do. They give you a problem and they ask you for a solution. And as I said, they're complex problems. So one problem may test 5 or 6 different concepts from arithmetic, algebra, and geometry. Your ability to solve problems is what's actually tested on SAT Math. And it's important to remember that you don't have much time. So you really have to be prepared for these questions that are on the SAT, and you have to know how to attack them. You have to know to recognize them and be able to answer them quickly to get the highest possible score. That's why you have to learn strategy for these questions. For all of these questions, you have to learn how to go about them. You have to be ready for what's coming. You have to know how to answer these questions. And then when test day comes, you have to be able to do that quickly to get a high score. On the first section, no calculator. On the second section, calculator. So you'll have to bring a calculator with you for the test. Now, on these different parts of the SAT, one of the really interesting things about the SAT is that almost all of the questions are multiple choice questions. Multiple choice questions. They don't ask you wide open questions and you have to write the answer. They give you the answers in the answer choices. And for all of the multiple choice questions on the SAT, there are only 4 answer choices. Only 4 possible choices, A, B, C, and D. Now, why that's important is because if you just randomly guess and just fill in one of the 4 choices, you have a 25% chance of getting it right, even if you have no clue what the right answer is. You have a 25% chance of of guessing the right answer. There are only 4 options on a multiple choice question. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, when I make multiple choice questions, I often make 5 possible answers, 6, 8, 10 possible answer choices. I make it as difficult as possible to really test whether the student can find the right answer. But on the SAT, they only give you 4 answer choices, meaning you have a 25% chance of guessing the right answer. So that's really not difficult when you consider that there's only 4 choices on a multiple choice question, and most of the questions on the SAT are multiple choice. So we're going to talk about strategy for how to find the right answer in these multiple choice questions when we get into the different question types. But it's important for you to understand most of the questions on the SAT are multiple choice questions. It's very easy to solve. On the math section, there is another kind of question. It's called a grid-in question, where you're actually going to write the numbers for the answers in, and it's scored electronically. So you're going to write them into boxes, and it's something that a computer can read. They're called grid-in answers. So mostly multiple choice, a few grid-in answers on the math section, and that's it for the SAT. 4 main sections that separate into 2 parts, verbal and math. The verbal part can score up to 800. The math part also up to 800, making a total possible score out of 1600 on the SAT. The test takes a total of 3 hours. It's a very tiring test. It's going to take a whole morning for you to take the SAT test. You have a good number of questions with very limited time. And so the pressure created by the time limits is going to be one of the biggest obstacles for you to earn a high score on the SAT. This is more reason why preparing for the SAT, learning the strategies for taking the SAT, studying in advance so that everything you see on the SAT is familiar when you take the SAT are very important skills. And this preparation can help you to raise your score hundreds of points. Because if a student takes this test and doesn't prepare for this test, they can lose hundreds of points off their potential score because they simply were not prepared for this test. They weren't prepared for the time requirement. They weren't prepared for the different types of questions. They weren't prepared to understand how to approach multiple choice questions. And they can cause their score to be hundreds of points lower than they could have been. And that's why most SAT prep courses, which can be very expensive, will guarantee students that they can raise their scores hundreds of points. Because it's just a fact that if you prepare strategically for the SAT, you will raise your score hundreds of points as compared to a student who doesn't prepare for the SAT. So the time restrictions, the question types, the divisions of these test sections, all of these things need to be prepared for in a unique way because it's not like a normal high school or homeschool test. And as we go through this course, we're going to get into all of these details and take practice tests, practice questions, learn all the strategies, get used to the time requirements, and so on. And we're going to help you get the highest possible score. So, for this second video, understanding why there's some confusion about the SAT, that there have been changes through the years, and how those changes affect you. There's no essay section anymore, just 2 parts, verbal and math, like in the old days. Understanding the 2 main divisions, verbal and math, and what they're composed of, how much time the entire test requires, what the highest possible score is, and then understanding the different types of answers that you're going to see. no fill in the blanks, no complete sentence answers, no essay answers, and so on. Just multiple choice and some grid-ins on the math section, and that's it. So that's all for this second video on SAT preparation. Make sure you know these things. Make sure you know all of these details, because all of this is going to be part of the strategy that we use to prepare for the SAT to help you score the highest possible score you can on this important test. I hope that's a helpful overview of what's on the SAT. In the videos to follow, we're going to get into all of this in detail. So study up, make sure you know everything we've covered so far, and we'll continue getting ready for the SAT. God bless.